there. We're there. Okay. And can you all hear me? I feel like oh, there we go. Now I'm in it. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Adrienne Cachelin, and this is Jen Shah. And we're, from the lower campus crowd, as we say. And yeah, the Center for, or the New School of Environment and Society and Sustainability, in case you hadn't heard of that before, is emerging in the College of Social and Behavioral Science, of Geography, and the Environmental and Sustainability Studies undergraduate program. So we're excited to have more research and teaching capacity. I'm excited to share with you today some of the things we've been thinking about climate grief and particularly women's experiences of climate anxiety and grief. We conducted this research this year with students at the U, really because we have seen so many students struggling with what is often construed as strictly bad news. I'm not going to say that climate change is good news, don't worry, but I think there are some interesting things that we'll see in these data that might be helpful. So it felt really necessary to learn more about the student experience and to think about how, it's our job to teach people about these frightening climate realities, and we don't want to hurt our students. So see if I have any more luck with this. Yeah, so there's actually 8 of us on this team of researchers, very interdisciplinary team. Jen and I, of course, and Debelina, our analysis wizard, is actually here today. Sarah Yo is from communication, and so she was really helpful in this work, as was Andrea Brunel from geography, Lynn Zumo from the College of Education, and Monica Lohani, who is from psychology. So quite the team of folks. Abby Nisler is one of our undergraduate students. Their honors thesis was based on some of the work that we'll be thinking about. So I think solid stage is front and center on this slide that you will see. But this thing that we call climate anxiety and climate grief is part of this larger eco-anxiety, this idea of, again, seeing changes and feeling worry about what's going on in our environment. That can be anything from biodiversity to kind of climate issues. We also talk about ecological grief or climate grief that can show itself in a large range of emotions. And I guess, normally when we think about student anxiety or student grief, we think like, how do we make it better? Or how do we avoid having it happen altogether? How can we work with this sort of difficult task? So we started to think about it a bit more deeply and read a bit more deeply. And thinking about, of course, y'all are medical professionals, so you probably know this more than I do, but this idea that eco-anxiety and ecological grief are actually natural responses to difficult times. And there's a thing that they now call practical anxiety, meaning you're anxious about something and you do something with that. And so we're going to talk about what our students are actually doing. Similarly with climate grief, ecological anxiety or ecological grief with this climate focus. There's this great book, if you are someone who is engaging with this kind of stuff, called Not Too Late: Changing the Narrative from Despair to Possibility. And they talk a little bit about the importance of being with your grief or being with your anxiety so that you can generate things like empathy and community and the sort of the positives that come out of those really hard times. And when we think about that and we think about how this works with students, we can be thinking about when and how can we find that kind of sweet spot of grief and anxiety that brings us to a place of students really getting engaged in different ways of thinking and coping with what's really terrifying information about the climate. So some things we know that climate anxiety is prevalent among youth. I mean, they have grown up, the students we have now have grown up with this in their horizon. We also know that females are more likely to suffer from anxiety and have heightened sensitivity to these unpredictable threats. We know that females are disproportionately affected by climate change, And we know that there can be negative mental health impacts. So again, as educators, we really need to better understand what to do about instruction and recognize that it differs by gender. And that's what we found in this year of doing this work. This is a quote by Aldo Leopold. I mean, I think we often think about this stuff as fairly new, but this is from 1953, where it says one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. He goes on to say, much of the damage inflicted on the land is quite invisible to the layman. Those were probably the good old days. But anyway, an ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. And I think even in that quote, we see some kinds of reckoning with this anxiety. You know, the idea of not wanting to be told otherwise is that notion of looking away that another climate expert, Naomi Klein, talks about. How I'm sure you all have friends or maybe yourselves think, I can only read so much news in a day, and then I got to look away. So how do we cope with some of these things, and how do we move forward? That's at the core of what we wanted to find out. And with that, Jen.
Great. Thanks, Adrienne. So for this presentation, we focused on 3 research questions, although we have a broader research project on this topic, which is asking a number of additional questions. But with each of these questions, we are asking how answers to them may differ by gender. And the 3 questions include, what is the prevalence of climate anxiety amongst undergraduate students? And does that differ amongst males and females? Oops, you somehow, oh, I see. There we go, I got it. Yay. How common is climate change a concern amongst undergraduate students? And again, does that differ by gender? And finally, what are the common strategies undergraduate students use for coping with climate change? We conducted the survey using we conducted the study using a survey, which we developed in Qualtrics and had approved by the IRB. And then we distributed this survey to undergraduates in several courses throughout the fall and spring semesters of the last year. Participation was voluntary, and extra credit was given to students who completed the survey. Gender in this study was self-identified amongst several binary and non-binary options, including the opportunity to elect preferring not to say. However, in the data we're presenting today, you'll see only 2 genders are presented because the majority of responses were cisgendered, and so the limited number of alternative responses were not sufficient enough to do statistical analyses. You'll note that females represented 66% of the folks that completed the survey. So again, we're going to focus on just 3 main questions from the survey, and that include 10 statements related to climate change that helped us ascertain the prevalence of climate anxiety, 11 options of coping strategies. And for both of these questions, for the coping strategies, there's also the option to note other and give an open-ended response. Note for these 2 categories of questions, we were asking frequency of attitude about the climate statements, or the frequency different coping strategies were utilized, and we used the Likert scale shown on the slide. For the last area on concerns, we asked students simply rank which concerns amongst a list of 11 options were their top 3 concerns, and climate was one of these. We then conducted a factor analysis with Verimax rotation and a test using Chromebox Alpha in our software to determine how related the climate statements were to one another, as well as, excuse me, which coping strategies were most related to one another. This allowed us to determine that actually all of the climate statements fell onto one factor. So we were able to construct an index, which I'll describe in a bit more detail in the next slide. We're calling the Climate Anxiety Index. And then second, we're able to identify 3 different factors or 3 broad coping strategy types. This slide is showing you the actual questions of climate statements related to climate anxiety. For the brevity, I won't read all of them, and nor are the individual responses detail I'd like to go into today, although the differences are important. I just want to reiterate that all of these statements fell onto one factor analysis that allowed us to sum. I'm sorry, I missed that. Okay. We took some responses from each of these statements for each respondent, and that then gave us an overall score for each individual, and that was the index per person that we utilized as our response variable in the additional analyses that I'll be showing you today. So this slide on the left is showing you a frequency distribution of our climate anxiety index. You see it's a slightly right skewed normal distribution, suggesting that the majority of students that completed the survey have mild to moderate levels of climate anxiety. The slide on the right is comparing climate anxiety between females, shown on the left, and males on the right. And we see that there's strong evidence that females have greater climate anxiety than males do. This slide is now showing you our list of concerns and how students ranked them. The black bars are number 1 ranking, and then the lightest gray is the 3rd most common concern. You'll see actually that climate is not the top concern. Rather, things that are personal concerns on a daily basis ranked higher. Yet amongst all the responses, it's still 15% of students rank climate in the top 3, which is very important to point out. Also, females were more likely to rank climate in their top 3 than males were. This is showing you the different types of coping mechanisms. And we'll note that the top 3 here show that students often use recreation, self-care, some form of self-care other than recreation, or changing one's own behavior as the top 3 coping mechanisms. However, our factor analysis did indicate that we could more simplify these responses into 3 different broad categories. And those include coping that we're calling meaning-focused coping mechanisms that include volunteerism, advocacy, changing one's own behavior, encouraging others to change behavior. Then the second category is variation in self-coping, such as talking to family, recreating, engaging in self-care. And lastly, coping mechanisms related to therapeutic measures, such as going to talk to a mentor, talking to a professional therapist, or attending a support group. And you'll see that we have strong evidence for females engaging in this meaning-focused coping, advocacy, or volunteerism at a higher frequency than males. There's weak evidence for gender differences in the other 2 categories, yet it looks like the mean response is very similar between the 2 genders. I just want to talk about this therapy coping mechanism really quickly, even though we didn't see strong difference. Anecdotally, we did see that the number of students who attended good grief circles that we've been offering on campus, this is a support group for folks who are experiencing climate anxiety and grief. The attendees tended to more often be females than males. This is an incredibly great resource for students, and we're looking for more partners to offer more of these circles. And folks can get trained as facilitators through the Good Grief Network, which I have a URL listed here on the slide. And this program was developed from a graduate of the Environmental Humanities program at the University of Utah with additional partners. Just coming back quickly to, where we did see strong evidence of a meaning-focused coping, I wanted to share a few quotes from our open-ended responses from students. And one example, you can read these, but I'll just read one for you. I feel responsible to be part of a solution after learning and knowing the current social injustices surrounding climate change. So students are really trying to channel that anxiety into meaningful action. And that is supported by what we see in the literature, that, as Adrienne mentioned, anxiety and grief can be a motivator to action, and that being active can help transform anxiety to optimism, or at least somewhat more positive feelings about what's going on in the world. With that, I'll let Adrienne close.
So we thought it seemed fitting to wrap up by thinking about women trailblazers leading the battle against climate change. These folks are government executives, CEOs, program leads. They work for NGOs, academics, they're activists. And there are a few examples from around the world, and I bet that we can all think of our own local examples as well. Probably many of you are familiar with Greta Thunberg. And again, when we think about mental health and issues around mental health, her story is a very interesting one. When she started thinking and reading about climate in like the 8 to 11-year-old phase, by 11, she stopped speaking and she stopped eating. And at 15, she decided that she was no longer going to go to school and instead do these climate strikes. And that is actually what brought her out of depression. And so a lot of authors, various folks refer to it as Greta's superpower, that she took something that was really hard and turned it into something that I think we can legitimately say is world changing. So I think we just want to leave you with this idea that, you know, while many women see the planet in the crosshairs more frequently, in terms of climate grief, they experience that and climate anxiety disproportionately. And this is true in less economically developed countries, as well as our own affluent university settings. The bright side, the good news, is that they're also more likely to cope with their climate anxiety and grief in ways that benefit us all. And for us, I think as educators, the trick is to better understand that pedagogical sweet spot where anxiety and grief can spur creative action, generate empathy, and help us be our best and happiest and most effective selves in the face of a rapidly changing climate. Oh, shoot.
Seeing as how we got a little bit of a late start, I think we can steal a few minutes for questions. Any questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was wondering what your next steps are, especially related to seeing these notable differences in disposition for action plans.
Repeat the question.
Yeah. What needs to be leveraged to help avoid there?
Yeah. So the question, and help me if I didn't get it all, but the question is kind of what are the next steps? And especially in terms of thinking about the different levels of response and engaging more response. You know, we've only just begun to look at some of these data. And another thing that we actually looked at was how much what the AAC&U, the American Association of Colleges and Universities, calls high impact practices, things like undergraduate research, things like community engaged learning, you know, various experiential kinds of learning. We're looking at if there's a correlation between those and folks who respond more actively. And everything tells us that there should be, but we haven't gone that deeply into the data quite yet. You have anything you want to add to that?
No, but I have been asked to let you all know you have microphones in front of you, that when you ask a question, you can press the button in front of you so that we can save some time by not repeating the question. But thank you for that very good question.
Okay, well, he did ask about men and women. So the difference is how we're going to increase not the eco-anxiety, but the engagement for men.
Yeah, I wish I knew. We'll keep looking and seeing if there, you know, how those correlations look in terms of those impact practices and see if they differ along gender as well. I think it's interesting to note too that there were so many more women that took this study, people identified as women that participated. So that's a really interesting thing too. And one just last thing I'll throw out that I think is interesting is that when we split out environmental studies majors from non, there were more like 25% of folks who listed it in their top 3 concerns. So there's this moment where we know targeted education is making a difference, hopefully not to hurt people, but to engage them.
And that is another major focus of our study, is to understand how our pedagogy is affecting mental health and how we can change our pedagogy to help mitigate and alleviate climate grief, and then channel it in these productive ways.
Well, I think for those of us elders who need some help with our climate grief, I'm looking for support group for people over 65 who just want to cry all the time. So
Please come to our good grief circle. Advertise.
thank you. Well, we're going to move from the external environment to our internal environment with our next speaker, who is Brenda Heaton, who is the Associate Dean for Research and Associate Professor of Epidemiology and Health Services Research at the University of Utah School of Dentistry. She's also Adjunct Associate Professor of Population Health Sciences at the Spencer Fox Eccles School of Medicine. And Dr. Heaton is an epidemiologist whose primary research interests include a focus on the social production of oral health. And this is a new one for all of you. I'm sure this is the first lecture you've heard on the social production of oral health, and I'm really excited. I'm brushing my teeth at just thinking about it.